Naomi Elkins was 38 years old when her husband of 9 years accepted his law school diploma with one hand and pressed a manila envelope into hers with the other, right there on the steps of the ceremony venue, while his classmates still had their caps on. Everyone who knew the Sullivans believed they understood the arrangement perfectly. Naomi ran the billing department at a regional hospital in Nashville, drove a 7-year-old Civic with a dent in the rear quarter panel she'd been meaning to fix for 2 years, and had spent the better part of a decade packing meal-prepped lunches and skipping vacations and picking up overtime at rates that made her colleagues wince, so that her husband Marcus could attend law school full-time without a loan to his name. His friends toasted him at every milestone as the man who had made it, and Marcus never once mentioned, not at the graduation party, not at the bar review celebration, not once in 3 years of casebook-heavy evenings at the kitchen table Naomi cleared for him every night, that the reason he had no debt was because someone else had taken on the weight of everything instead. The envelope he handed her that afternoon on the courthouse steps contained divorce papers prepared by a firm downtown, signed in advance, citing irreconcilable differences, and requesting an equal division of assets, as though 9 years of triple shifts and deferred dreams were assets they had built together equally. What Marcus never thought to check, not once in 9 years of watching Naomi work every available hour, was the one account she had never once mentioned to him, or the name that sat on the patent her late grandfather had registered 40 years earlier and quietly passed to her through a trust Marcus had never known existed. $200,000 and 9 years of her life. He was about to discover that the invoice had come due in a currency he was completely unprepared to pay. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. 7 years before that graduation afternoon, on the Sunday evening after Marcus first told her about law school, Naomi had been sitting at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a calculator, the same way her grandfather Odell had taught her to sit with any big decision, working through numbers before feelings. Odell had been a machinist his whole career, and in his retirement he'd become a careful, methodical investor in small patents, licensing agreements, and residential real estate, always with a yellow legal pad and a mechanical pencil and a patience that struck his colleagues as almost unreasonable for a man who had started with nothing. He kept every receipt in a manila envelope labeled by year, every projection on its own numbered page, every meeting note in the same handwriting that ran straight across unlined paper without ever wandering. "Run the numbers first," he used to tell Naomi, who'd followed him around his small home office since she was old enough to read a spreadsheet. "Then let yourself feel whatever's left over." She had run the numbers that Sunday evening and found that Marcus's plan was financially possible if she stretched everything and gave up almost everything else. She had let herself feel whatever was left over. It was, she realized later, the most expensive feeling she'd ever had. Marcus had come in from the kitchen with 2 glasses of iced tea, set one down beside her legal pad, and asked what she was working out. "Whether we can afford this," she said. He sat across from her and looked at the numbers and said, very gently, "We can't do this without you, Nay. I know that. And when I pass the bar, I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you know I know it." He said it the way a man says something true, with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on hers. She believed him completely. She kept the legal pad in a drawer and pulled out a new one the following week to start the actual budget. Only Odell's estate attorney, a small practice man named Gerald, who had handled her grandfather's affairs for 20 years, and Naomi herself, knew that the trust Odell had structured before he died held 2 things of substance: a minority licensing interest in a tooling patent that had been generating modest, steady quarterly payments for 11 years, Payments that arrived electronically to an account in Naomi's name, a loan at a credit union Marcus had never set foot in, and a residential property in Murfreesboro that had been quietly appreciating for the same period. The patent wasn't glamorous. Neither was the property. But Odell had taught her that the most useful assets were always the ones that kept working in the background while everything else demanded attention. And both of these had been doing exactly that since the year before she married. Marcus had met Odell twice, at holiday dinners, and had liked him in the distracted way people like someone whose relevance to their own future they have not yet calculated. When Odell died 2 years into the marriage, Marcus had sent flowers and said he was sorry, and Naomi had handled the estate paperwork quietly, the way she handled everything that didn't require his signature. She had met Marcus 11 years earlier at a hospital fundraiser, back when he was 27 and working in pharmaceutical sales, tall and confident in a good suit and asking questions about her work with what felt, at the time, like genuine curiosity. He'd remembered specific details the next time they spoke, the names of colleagues she'd mentioned, a project she described only briefly, and something about being that carefully listened to had undone her in a way she hadn't expected. She married him 2 years later at a small venue her family helped pay for, and for the first 4 years of the marriage he had been, in most of the ways that counted, exactly who he appeared to be at that fundraiser. She had only slowly stopped noticing the moment that version of him had changed, and slower still stopped making excuses for the gap between who he'd been then and who he was now. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks before graduation. Not the one he would hand her on the steps. A different envelope, smaller, from a law school admissions office addressed only to Marcus, which she found open on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower. She didn't read it. She registered that it existed, that it was open and face down, which was different from how mail usually sat on that counter, and that when Marcus came downstairs, he picked it up and slid it into his briefcase without mentioning it, the way a person disposes of something they've already processed privately. She kept that small observation the way she kept everything her grandfather had taught her to keep. Filed, dated, revisited when the pattern clarified. 3 days later, sorting through their joint email account for a utility bill she needed for a work reimbursement, she found a thread she hadn't been included on. A law school alumni network message forwarded between Marcus and 3 classmates, congratulating each other on offers from firms in 3 different cities. Marcus's offer was from a boutique litigation firm in Chicago, a city neither of them had ever discussed living in, a city whose name had never once appeared in any of the conversations they'd had about what came next. The email was dated 6 weeks earlier. She read it twice, the way she read any document that contradicted a prior assumption. Her hands didn't shake. She printed the thread, folded it once, and placed it in the drawer where she still kept her grandfather's legal pad from the night she'd run the first set of numbers 9 years earlier. The drawer was getting full. She did not ask him about it. She went to work the following Monday and requested her full employment history and compensation record from HR, the kind of documentation a person assembles when they need to put a financial picture on paper. Then, she called Gerald. Gerald had retired from active practice, but still kept his license current and still answered the phone for Odell's granddaughter without hesitation. He listened to her describe the situation in the same calm, sequential way Odell used to describe a problem. And when she finished, he asked 2 questions. The first was whether Marcus's name appeared anywhere on the trust documents. It did not. The second was whether she had kept records of every tuition payment, living expense, and career sacrifice she had made over the course of his law school enrollment. She had kept all of it, in a folder she updated quarterly, the way her grandfather had taught her to document anything that might one day need to be explained to someone who hadn't been there to see it. "Then, come see me," Gerald said, "and bring the folder." Naomi drove to Gerald's home office on a Saturday morning and sat across from him at the same kind of small wooden desk her grandfather had used, and spread the folder open between them. Tuition receipts. Living expense logs. 3 years of her own tax returns, showing the income she had directed away from her own retirement contributions and toward his enrollment costs. A salary projection she had never pursued, attached to a job posting from her 3rd year of paying his tuition, for a director-level position she hadn't applied for because the timing would have conflicted with his bar prep schedule. The Chicago firm email, folded once, placed last. Gerald read through all of it without a single change of expression, the way a man who has been reading documents for 40 years reads something that has weight. When he finished, he looked up and said only, "In Tennessee, what you've described has a name. It's called dissipation of marital assets, and a court can account for it in ways that go well beyond an equal split." He tapped the salary projection with one finger. "This in particular is called career impairment. It matters in a courtroom the way it mattered in your real life, which is considerably." He set the page down and looked at her the way Odell used to look at a calculation that had come back the way he expected. "How complete is your documentation?" She told him she had every receipt going back to the first tuition wire. He nodded once. "Your grandfather taught you right." He leaned back and said the thing Odell would have said. "Run the numbers, Naomi. Then we let the paperwork do the talking." She didn't go home and confront Marcus. She went home and made dinner and asked about his bar prep timeline and listened to him talk about the Chicago firm's practice areas with a specificity that told her he had already been thinking about it for some time. "You've really been putting in the work," she said, and meant it in a way he couldn't quite read. He smiled and thanked her and refilled his own glass and did not once ask about hers. She called her cousin Tara the following evening, the one family member who had watched the whole 9 years with a skepticism she had always kept mostly quiet. Tara drove down from Clarksville the same weekend and sat across from Naomi at that same kitchen table with a glass of wine and listened to the whole story. And when Naomi finished, Tara said only, "Tell me what you need and I'll be wherever you need me to be." Real power operated in quiet rooms, and this was one of those rooms. The counter-evidence assembled itself almost naturally once Gerald's referral to a family law attorney named Cecile Marsh was in place. Cecile was 44, ran a small firm in Brentwood, and had spent 15 years helping women untangle marriages where one person's ambitions had run entirely on someone else's fuel, which meant she had seen this particular shape of case often enough to recognize it before the folder was even halfway open. She reviewed Gerald's trust summary, Naomi's documentation folder, and the Chicago firm email thread without a single change of expression, and then asked a question nobody had yet thought to ask. Had Marcus taken out any personal credit in the past 6 months? The kind of credit a person opens when they intend to start a new life on a known future salary? He had. A credit card opened 4 months earlier, a balance of $11,000, carrying charges for furniture delivery, apartment deposits, and a shared streaming account with an unfamiliar email address attached. The statement's contact address was listed as an apartment in Chicago, with a lease start date of the 1st of the following month. The apartment had been signed before graduation, before the divorce papers, before he'd said a word to Naomi about any of it. The plan had been in place, Cecile noted calmly, before he'd even finished the degree Naomi had paid for. "He wasn't leaving when he handed you that envelope," Cecile said. He'd already left. The envelope was just the notification. Through all of it, Naomi kept going to work, kept packing her lunch in the same insulated bag, kept saying goodnight to Marcus the way she always had. She asked about his bar prep timeline and listened to him talk about the Chicago firm's practice areas with a specificity that told her he had already been thinking about it for some time. She made no indication she knew about Chicago, or about Gerald, or about Cecile, or about the apartment lease whose start date she had now added to the folder. "You've really been putting in the work," she said one evening, and meant it in a way he couldn't quite read. He smiled and thanked her and refilled his own glass and did not once ask about hers. She signed nothing he gave her. She answered questions from his attorney's office with the single sentence Cecile had prepared for exactly that purpose. All correspondence regarding this matter should be directed to counsel. 2 weeks after graduation, Marcus's attorney's office sent a follow-up requesting her signature on the initial filing. Cecile responded with a counterfiling that listed, on 4 attached pages, every tuition payment, every deferred career advancement, every missed retirement contribution, every sacrifice with a dollar amount attached, and the current appraised value of the Murfreesboro property, which had more than doubled since Odell registered the deed. The response also included, on its final page, a request for discovery of all financial accounts opened in Marcus's name in the prior 12 months, all credit applications, and all signed lease agreements. Marcus's attorney called Cecile's office the same afternoon the counterfiling arrived. He did not sound like a man who had expected this conversation. The conference room at Cecile's Brentwood office had tall windows and a long table, and the particular silence of a room where consequential things are regularly said without anyone raising their voice. On the Tuesday morning 3 weeks after graduation, it held exactly the people who needed to be there, and no others. Marcus arrived with his attorney, a junior partner from the firm handling his case, expecting what he had clearly assumed would be a formality, a negotiation between professionals where his own legal training would give him an advantage he hadn't had in any prior conversation with Naomi. He sat across from Cecile's table and found, in order, Gerald, who had driven over from his home office at 72 years old specifically for this meeting, and sat at the far end with a single folder in front of him. Tara, who sat near the window with her arms crossed, and said nothing at all and didn't need to. And across from him, with a folder she did not open immediately, sat Naomi. He walked in expecting a signature. He walked into a conversation he had not written. Cecile laid the documents out one at a time, the way someone does when they want each page to land before the next one arrives. The tuition payment history, $212,000 over 3 years, sourced entirely from Naomi's income. The career impairment calculation, prepared by a forensic economist Gerald had consulted, showing the projected earnings differential between the director-level position Naomi had not pursued and her current salary, calculated forward over a 10-year period. The retirement account shortfall, $241,000 in foregone contributions and compound growth at actuarial projection rates. The Chicago apartment lease, its start date circled in blue. The credit card statement. And last, a 1-page summary of the Odell Elkins Family Trust, its assets, its appraised values, and the name of its sole beneficiary. A name that did not appear anywhere on Marcus's initial filing because he had never known it was there to include. Marcus looked at the trust document for a long moment, reading the beneficiary name, then looking up at Naomi the way a person looks at a room they thought they knew the dimensions of. "I didn't know about this," he said. "I know you didn't," Naomi said. "That's the point." His attorney leaned forward and said something about equitable distribution, about the standard presumption of an equal split, about the contributions both parties had made to the marital estate, about Naomi's financial support having been voluntary and mutually agreed upon. He said it with the measured confidence of someone who had read the initial filing and felt it was solid. Cecile let him finish. Then she walked him, point by point, through what equitable distribution actually meant in the presence of documented dissipation, career impairment, and a non-marital inheritance that had never at any point been commingled with joint assets or used to fund joint expenses. She spent approximately 11 minutes doing it. When she finished, his attorney sat back and said very little. Marcus's expression moved through several stages in measured succession. Confidence first, then recalculation, then something that looked less like fear and more like the specific, unpleasant recognition of a man who had prepared for one kind of conversation and found himself seated in another kind entirely. "You had 9 years to see what this cost me," Naomi said, her voice even, unhurried, carrying none of the weight it might have if she'd said it the day he handed her the envelope. "You built a career on my salary and handed me paperwork like we'd split the work evenly. I'm not angry about it. I ran the numbers. The numbers have an answer." Marcus tried once more, the way people do when they've prepared a version of events they still believe might work. "We talked about this together. You agreed. It wasn't something I did to you, Nay. We were partners. Partners divide labor," Gerald said from the end of the table, in the quiet, final voice of a man who has been patient with a problem for long enough. "She worked 3 jobs worth of hours on one salary, so you could work 0. That's not a partnership. That's a ledger with one name on the expenses side." He folded his hands on the table and said nothing further, because nothing further was needed. Naomi closed her folder, stood, and gathered her things with the same unhurried precision she'd used at every step of the 9 years she'd spent making this man's ambitions possible. She did not rush. She did not look at him while she put on her jacket. "You'll hear from Cecile," she said. "I hope the Chicago firm is everything you planned it to be. You should know the plans you made were visible for longer than you realized." She walked out of the conference room without looking back. Behind her, the room stayed entirely quiet except for the sound of Marcus's attorney sliding Cecile's counter filing back in front of his client. And then, the quieter sound of Marcus himself, a licensed attorney, sitting across from the documentation of what he'd done while the woman who paid for his degree walked away without once raising her voice. 14 months later, the Murfreesboro property had a fresh exterior, a long-term tenant paying market rate, and a second unit permitted and under renovation. The plans drawn by a contractor Naomi had interviewed and selected herself on a Saturday morning with a legal pad in her hand. Naomi had taken the director-level position at a larger hospital system that spring, the kind of role she'd been qualified for 3 years earlier, and had set aside so someone else could study. Her salary in the first year of the new role exceeded, by a margin that would have seemed impossible to the version of her packing meal prep containers and picking up overtime, anything she had earned in any single year of the marriage. She had used a portion of the trust's quarterly distributions to fund the first year of a paralegal certification program she'd enrolled in on a Tuesday night. Not because she needed it professionally, but because, sitting in that Brentwood conference room, she had understood for the first time exactly how powerful it was to know how a document worked before anyone handed it to you. She had someone new in her life now, a quiet internal auditor named Jerome Whitfield, who had noticed, at a hospital finance conference, that her presentation on billing system efficiency had anticipated every question the panel asked before they asked it, and who'd told her afterward, without any performance behind it, that he'd never seen anyone run a room that carefully. He didn't need the credit for anything. He noticed the work first, the way Marcus once had, except with Jerome the noticing never went anywhere. It wasn't welcome. Word of Marcus's situation reached her the way most things did now, through Tara and without being asked for. The Chicago firm had offered him an associate position, not the senior track he'd described over dinner, and the settlement had required a structured payout to Naomi over 4 years that his entry-level associate salary would service uncomfortably. A classmate who knew both of them had told Tara that Marcus had started referring to the settlement at social events as something that had been done to him. His mother, who had attended the graduation ceremony and watched her son hand Naomi that envelope with an expression Naomi had clocked but not commented on, called Naomi 6 months later to say she was sorry and that she had known something was wrong the moment she saw his face on those steps, and that Odell would have been proud of the way Naomi had handled every single part of it. Naomi heard all of it once, registered it, and went back to her numbers. On a Sunday morning that winter, she sat at her grandfather's old legal pad at the kitchen table that was now only hers, with coffee going warm in both hands, and began sketching a projection for the second unit's estimated return against the remaining trust balance. The same way Odell had taught her to sit with any decision worth making. Run the numbers first, then let yourself feel whatever's left over. She ran them. What was left over this time felt nothing like sacrifice. She was free. She was solvent. She had built every bit of it the only way that it ever actually worked. Quietly, in her own name. On paper. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.